Welcome back, everybody. In this lesson, we are going to look at a functionality in Karate framework related to the reusability of code or the test scenarios. The feature that we are going to look at is how to call a feature file from other feature files. First of all, why would you want to do that? Uh, Consider, let's say there are two feature files, right? Feature file 1 and feature file 2. Feature file 1, you have written a scenario which performs some test. Maybe it calls an API and returns a response. And then in feature file 2, there are some other scenarios that you want to test. But at the same time, you want to repeat the same steps that you have carried out in feature 1. One option you have is you duplicate the code that is written in feature file F1 in feature file 2, and at every places you do the same thing over and over again. You repeat it every time. Or the other option is you modularize the code. Your code still remains in feature file 1, and you just call feature file 1 from feature file 2. Consider it as how you would do in a programming language with respect to any functions, right? You have a function definition and you call this function from multiple places by providing parameters. So similarly, even with feature files, you can call another feature file to run the scenarios present in that feature file by providing parameters. And that is the functionality that we are going to look at today. So like it says, you can reuse feature file and call it by passing parameters, and also extract the response in the caller feature file by looking at the variables of the returned result, right? The typical use case is, so far we have been dealing with unprotected endpoints, right? We did not have to provide any authentication to access our routes. So far, all of our routes were unauthenticated, be it posts and albums and all the other routes. But in your testing environment, many of your routes would be protected. Typically, you would want, let's say, an access token to be present in the HTTP header. And only if you have the token would you allow the endpoint response to be returned back to the client. Right? So that is the typical use case. So the setup that I'm going to working with today is a local setup. The endpoints which are present on this remote mock server that we have been using so far contains only unprotected routes. And so I have created my own a local server here. And if you see, there are four routes basically. There's the familiar posts route and albums route, but both of these routes are protected. You can see it from the auth middleware that is applied to this endpoint. So unless you provide authentication, you won't be allowed to access posts. And to be able to provide an access token, you need to sign in using the login API. So using this endpoint, you provide email and password, and in return, you receive a token, and that token you are expected to pass in an header when accessing post and album. And of course, only those users can log in who have already registered with this server, right? So in short, before we jump on to Karate, let me show what I've been saying over here in Postman. So you have, my server is running on 3000. So I have, I'm calling the register API. Let's say I provide this user, I need to provide first name. Let's say it is ABC789. The last name, let's say XYZ789. And again, provide a unique email ID and let this be the password. If I do send, my user is created. Now, if I use this user uh, and I can then log in with that user to receive the access token. So here I receive the access token, and I use this access token in the header to access any of the protected routes. So let's say I'm using post. If I don't use the access token header, if I try to access it directly, it says a token is required for authentication. But if I use the token that I just received, sorry, this wasn't the one. If I use this, if I you let me use the post, if I use this token now, it returns a list of posts, right? So this is what we are going to try out in uh, karate as well. So first thing, let me create a feature file. Let me call this as uh, requests or reusability feature. Okay, let me copy something from the existing feature file as the starting point. Uh, so this is verify, let's say reusability. Initialize stuff is fine. This time I'm not using the remote mock server, but I'm using my own, which is HTTP localhost. It is running on port 3000. Here I want to verify protected route, protected endpoint, let's say posts, right? And path is good. Then the method is get, which is fine. I'm not really interested in post ID at this point. Let me also see if I also probably need this header. Right. If I, and let me also, I don't have any assertion to check for at the moment. This is not an outline at this moment, it's just a scenario. And so let me just print response at this point. And that is it. So I have this, I'm trying to access the posts API on this server and expecting 300, 200. But as you know, this shouldn't pass, right? Because it's a protected route and I'm not passing any token. So it should fail. So we expect it to fail. What does it say? It says 403, right? And if I don't pass this, it returns 403, which is an expected response. We can also check that in the report, in the karate report. And if you see here, of course, it didn't go to the print response. I should have put that ahead of than 200, but nonetheless, we can see what it received, right? So what if I just passed end header, right? And we know what it is called. We also know, let's pick up a valid header that we just used from Postman, just to make sure that this works in karate first. And let me run this again. And now if I look at it, the test case passed, right? So I can just verify in the route as well, and you see it goes through and I receive an array of posts, right? Maybe I also want in the same feature file, I also want to test, let's say the other uh, protected route, which is albums, right? And which is pretty much the same. You, you look at this in Postman, if I just use the same route, the same access key for albums, if I run this, it returns another set of an array of albums. And again, over here, I expect this to run without problem because I'm using access token now. But you see the problem, these access tokens are typically, uh, short-lived, right? So this wouldn't fly all the time. So next time you run your test suite, this access token will not be valid anymore. Of course, one trick you could have done is because it is the same access token in all of them. I could have said, define this token at one place only, right? So I could just say, and I could just use it over here. And that is not the right one. Let me just take the full thing, and or let's take this, and this is not the right thing. And then I use this, let's say if I call this as auth token, and then I can use it over here, right? And the same thing I can repeat over here. And now if I try to run this, uh, what does it say? I just found out the problem was because of this dash in the variable, and when it is used with header. So if I just remove this dash, so if I uh, run this with dash, you see that problem coming up. If I just remove this dash, it looks like there's an issue when you provide a dash in the header. If you remove the header, it works just fine. All right, so it's a new thing I learned today. Uh, anyway, the bigger point is I could have odd token defined at one location and then reused it in multiple scenarios. But the problem still remains because this token is short-lived. One way it would have been to call the login API just before calling the post API and use that uh, in each of the scenario, and then use that login API again in this and do that, right? Or I could just do it in background so that it is, I do it once in the background for this feature file. But imagine you have multiple such feature files which are testing other protected APIs, and you would again still you'll be repeating yourself in the backgrounds of those feature file. So ideally what you would want to do is isolate the login API in a feature file of its own, and then call that feature file from this feature file, and of course in this case in the background, and get the token from the other feature file and reuse it over here, right? So this is what we are going to do. So what we will do here is, we will call this as let's say sign in token, and we will call this is a special keyword, and we will uh, provide a feature file name. This is the feature file that we are going to create. Let's call it login.feature, and then we will provide uh, parameters to it, right? And we saw in the login uh, API, it needs an email and a password. So we'll pass the email, right? And we will pass password. Uh, let's just maybe use the one that we already tried. Let's use this. Let's use the same password, right? So, and in here, instead of this token now, what we will be saying is nation or token is uh, an in token dot response, or just as token, and we will see why I've done sign in token dot token very shortly. Okay, one other thing I missed over here is I forgot the def keyword because it's a variable. So that's it. Let's go ahead and write this login.feature file. Let me create this as login.feature. Let me copy some of this code again. And let me say this is not reusability. This feature is about authentication. And let's call it initialize stuff. It's the same server where the login API is hosted. I don't want, this is the place that will generate the token, so I don't want it to provide anything. In this case, it's a login API, and when I post on login API, I expect, let's check here, it will return 200 okay, and this will be the response, right? And out of this response, this is the token that we are interested in, and that was the reason why I did sign in token dot token, because it is this token I'm particularly interested in. And I think this looks okay. If status is 200, if this is post, this is not where I expect the token. And the only thing I need now is to create a post, I need to pass a request body, right? And in the body, what I need to pass is an email and the password, right? And if you look at the caller feature file, it passed me email and password, and I need to be using this email and password. So just like any other variable, I will have to use it over here. So we call this as an email and this as the password. Just verify uh, that our calling is appropriate. Use over here, and if you see, this is the way we pass stuff, and this is the way we this is the way we use those variables which were passed in by the calling feature file. So we have used email and password, and using this request body, we make a post. Hopefully this should work. Let's just run this and verify. Only let's run only one of the tests and see what it does. It returned an error, and it says token is required for authentication, auth token, sign in. So looks like all right. I think other thing I need to do is we are calling this a sign in token, uh, and uh, that there's two ways you can do it. Uh, if you look at the report, you see here in the background we ran so before calling the post API, in the background we ran the login API because we called this feature file passing in the email and password, and it created a post request. And if you look at the response, it rightly got the response, but this is the response object, right? So the name of that variable is a response object. So what we can do over here is, let's just say this as response.token, because sign in is the whole object. And if let me also print what sign in object actually returns. So it returns a lot many things than just the response object, but we are particularly interested in the response, and within that response we are interested in token. So that is the reason why we are doing it over here. So if you look at over here, this is the sign in object, right? It contains response headers, e-tags, a lot, the response headers part, the status, everything related to the response, and not just the response body. But particularly we are interested in the response body, and this is the keyword that we are using over here. And within the response, we are more interested in the token so that we can use it as access token. So there you go. Now you have uh, and if you look at it now, let me just clear this up, and if I run this at the feature level and look at the result, the two tests, both of the tests passed. And if I come here to the report, you see both my posts API and albums API is working fine now, because it uses the auth token by creating the auth token by calling the feature file that implements the login API, right? What if, however, this works fine if there's only one scenario in that feature file? What if there were other scenarios there, right? For instance, if I were to even uh, if there was the register scenario also, which was put here, right? Test register API, right? And I wouldn't the way you would do it over here is you will call register API here, right? And then pass stuff right here. You'll pass as the first name, last name, and do other stuff. There could be other scenarios in related to authentication in this feature file, right? Let me just mimic this and just say, okay, there is a scenario which just prints things, right? Which just says hello, right? Which is still a scenario over here. And Now, and there could be multiple such scenarios, right? Now, when you run this, now when you run the calling feature file, it would still pass because the function that we are interested in, the login API, still exists. But if there were any other scenarios, which if it did not have the proper data, it could fail. This wouldn't fail because it is just printing. But if you look at the report file, right, you look over here in the background. When we call this login.feature file, it ran not just the scenario that we were interested in, but it ran both the scenarios, right? It also ran the hello scenario. And you can imagine if there were many scenarios, it would run all of them. Some of them would fail, your test would fail, right? But how do we only run a specific scenario when we are calling a feature file from other feature file? The way to do that is use a feature called as tags. We will go deeper into the text feature in future videos, but for now let's just say we name or tag this feature for this particular scenario as login. And now if I only want to call the login scenario when I call this feature file, I could just specify it over here by saying @login. Now if I run this whole feature file again, you should, this still passes. And let me come over here, let me just refresh this. And if I run this, if I go to background, if I go to my login feature file, it only calls the specific scenario that was tagged, right? And it does not call the print hello scenario in this case. So the point being, if you have multiple scenarios in the feature file that is being called, and if you're only interested in a particular scenario, you can use it, you can call it using tags. On another point related to tagging, if you run login.feature file as a whole, you will find that this scenario, the second scenario, fails, right? And as expected, because this scenario was created so that it is called in from some other feature file and by providing this email and password as parameters. But if we run it directly as we would run any other feature file, it wouldn't find email and password and it would fail. So you can see that response return is invalid credentials because the request that it sent to the server was hash email and hash password, and it wasn't replaced with anything, right? In such a scenario where you only want to keep a scenario to be called from other feature files but not to be executed in itself, you can use another special annotation or tag called as ignore. And now if you run this, it would just ignore this particular scenario and would just one scenario, which is the print hello scenario over here, right? And that is how you ignore, you ask karate to ignore running a particular test scenario. Finally, a bit about optimization. You see that reusability.feature file calls login.feature file in the background. And because the code in the background runs every time any scenario in this feature file runs, this means that this code will run two times because there are two scenarios. Every time just before the scenario runs, we will call this code. This is not exactly what we want. Ideally, what we would want is to call a login API, get the access token, and reuse that access token for both of these scenarios. How would you do that? So Karate provides a keyword called as call once that you could use instead of call. What it does is it executes the code only once. It caches the result and reuses the result the next time the call is made. So if we just replace, if before using call once, I'll just rerun with the call keyword. And if I go here and look at the uh, summary report, you will see that in the background, I've made the call to login endpoint, and you see that the post request is made to login endpoint, and then we call the posts API, and next with the albums, again the background runs, call the login path, and again you see uh, another call is made to the login endpoint. So two calls are made to the login endpoint to fetch the access token. But instead, now if we use call once instead of call, And if we run this again, you should see call to login API being made only once. Now, if I go here and look at the background code again, you will expect the login code going out once. So you see call to login endpoint here, and then we make a call to, this is the response that we got, this is the token that we received, and the call is made to the post API. And now when we call the albums API in the uh, background, you see here, you don't see a post call being made to login, and we still use the sign-in token received from the previous call, and we still make a call to the albums API, and it is 200. Okay, so that is how, if you have a use case where you would want to execute any piece of code only once, and you still want to keep it in background, this is how you would do it using call once. So there you go. This is how you would reuse the code by putting it in feature file and calling it from from multiple places. I hope this makes sense and it is clear. I will see you in the next video. Thank you.